say first, I want to go back to the oil and gas exploitation, because it's another example of also government misusing public opinion polls. We've done public opinion polls here as well. And what we see is that when you ask people, do you want Quebec to exploit oil and gas? People say, no, 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 no. The majority says no, because they think we're going to pollute and blah. And then when you say, okay, there's a war currently in Ukraine, it's having this impact on Germany. Do you think we should send them our liquefied gas? Yes or no? Then you have a strong majority that's saying yes, 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 yes.
Yeah, exactly.
So you have to be very cautious with the data of those polls. You can't govern by polls, because depending on how you put the context in, you're going to have different results. I'm not in politics to follow polls. I'm in politics to lead polls. And as opposed to our government, we never had a government here in Quebec that has been polling as much people. It's 2-3 polls per day on average that they've done over the last few years. It's crazy. They probably polled more in this mandate than in Quebec's history altogether. And so I decided to run for a party that was at 1% and had 500 members. I was not attracted by the limousine or the title or power. What drives me is my ideas, is my ideal, is what I'm looking for, my vision for Quebec for the future. And I think that's a huge difference. And people know, and they could say, and I could testify, that I'm not there. I'm not an opportunist. And what I'm telling them, I'm not telling them 50 things. I'm not going to change Quebec altogether overnight. But there's 4 or 5 things that I want to change. I'm going to put some private in healthcare. I'm going to lower taxes for people. I'm going to exploit and even export our oil and gas in Quebec. I will give more freedom of choice to parents in the education of their kids, and even for kindergarten, because here we have a public daycare that is becoming almost a public monopoly that scares me off. I'm going to, so there's a few things like that we're going to focus on for the first 4 years. And I think that if we just achieve that, it's going to be huge.
Even if you just achieved that on the energy front, I mean, look at the situation that Canada's in, is that we could be rich. We're about 35% behind the Americans now in terms of our level of wealth. And the economic foreseers, I don't remember which group, but it was a reputable group, estimated that of the G20 countries, Canada would have the lowest economic growth for the next 4 decades, by which time we should be 50% or 75% behind the Americans. When instead, imagine what we have in front of us. Saskatchewan, I think, has more uranium than the rest of the world combined, if I remember that correctly. We have almost inexhaustible oil and gas reserves, despite what people think. Natural gas is extremely clean compared to the alternatives, particularly coal. We could ramp up our production of fossil fuels in the clean and sustainable and moral manner that ethical Canadian businesses could offer. We could make ourselves rich and make our lives abundant for our children while doing so. We could provide that energy to China so that they could be less reliant on coal, and to Europe so that the Europeans would have a diversified energy supply at a much lower cost, and so we could make poor people rich around the world by doing so. We could increase geopolitical stability massively by differentiating our energy supplies, and the net consequence for the environment by the environmental standards would be beneficial compared to the alternative, which is, well, we'll destabilize things so rapidly like we did in Sri Lanka that we're going to throw people into poverty and blow the whole system of international trade, which is bloody well what we're risking right now in places like Europe. It'll be a miracle if the European Union even survives, as far as I can tell, the next year. Because when the energy crunch hits this winter, which it's very likely to do, there's going to be absolute hell to pay. I mean, 70,000 people were demonstrating yesterday in Czechoslovakia. So we're playing with fire, and it is this bloody virtue signaling that says, well, of course I care about the environment. And so it's time to put the forcible clamps down on the access that poor people have to energy, as if that's going to do anything whatsoever except make a bad situation worse on every possible front.
Another sacred cow that we're attacking, and that's going to be of interest for Canadians outside of Quebec, is healthcare, because that's another thing that the virtue signaling is very, very important. We want everybody to have universal access, free, and the best in the world, and blah blah. We know the rest of how they see it. But the reality is that our system is inefficient. And in Quebec, one of the reasons why we had to lock down our population more than anywhere else in the continent is because our healthcare system is probably the most inefficient. And we need to fix that. And obviously, it's not some small reform within a public monopoly that is going to achieve that. Monopolies are not good. It's not efficient. And we need to open up. We need to increase. We need to have competition. We need to decentralize. And unfortunately, the centrally planned system that we have right now is not good. Quebecers are spending $1 billion every single week in a system that couldn't handle 200 or 300 patients in the intensive healthcare facilities.
Well, did Quebec build in most of Canada? While the pandemic was raging, the government seemed to be utterly unable to build more emergency beds, despite the fact that the pandemic raged for a couple of years and despite the fact that there was a tremendous amount of money spent. So what kind of differentiated and detailed vision do you have for improving the healthcare system by introducing some private-public diversification? And why shouldn't people be afraid of that?
Well, first off, we have to respect the Canada Health Act, which says that everybody could have access to free services, and it's universal. So we're going to respect the Canada Health Act. We're not running federally, we're running provincially, but we want to also make sure, the principle is that it's an insurance that is public. It doesn't mean that you have to deliver the services in a public monopoly. So what we're saying is that we already have clinics that are private in Quebec, but currently it's 100 or 0, which means like a physician needs to work for the public system 100%, or for the private system 100%. He can't go 50-50 or 70-30. It's you're either with us or with the enemy, like kind of thing. We want to change that. We want to give the freedom to physicians to say, look, if you can't work more than 2 or 3 days, because that's a lot of them are stuck with that because they don't have access to operation facilities or all sorts of things. So then you can spend your extra time and go in the private sector and give more services to the population. That's one thing. The second thing we want to say is that you can have an insurance. You can invest in your health. It's crazy in Canada. You can invest to drink as much as you want if you go to a liquor store, a public monopoly of liquor store, or you can invest, you can gamble in a public utility also with as much money as you want, but you can't invest a penny in what's the most important in your life and the life of your family, which is your health.
Yeah, so for those who are listening, some of you are going to, especially the younger people with perhaps somewhat less experience, you're going to think, well, we don't want